Hi, welcome to another episode of MYD Global. I'm your host, Leanne Hackman-Carty. You're going to want to see this episode today. I'm talking to Craig Fugate. He was a previous FEMA administrator for a number of years under the Obama administration. And in 2011, he actually organized recovery efforts for a record number of 87 disasters. But what I'm talking to him about is specifically the Waffle House Index, a term he coined. And it really is a great indicator of how communities are doing when it comes to that actual response. So stay tuned. Hey, Craig, thanks for taking the time to talk to me for a few minutes today. How are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Good. Well, before we get started, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background?
Yeah, I've been doing emergency management, emergency services for all of my adult life. I started out as a volunteer firefighter. I was a paramedic firefighter for the county I lived in down in Florida. Became the local county emergency manager. Went to the state of Florida. Worked there for over a decade. Ultimately serving as the state director of emergency management for the state of Florida, and we. Most notably was the 2004 and 2005 hurricane seasons. In 2004, we were hit by 4 hurricanes in 1 year. And I led that team through all that. And then in 2009, I was asked to join the Obama administration as the administrator of FEMA. And I served as the administrator of FEMA through the 2 terms of the administration. And since I've left FEMA, I do a lot of consulting and advising. And I'm also Chief Emergency Management Officer at a company out here in California called One Concern that deals with AI applications in predicting hazard impacts.
Oh, very cool. Well, maybe we'll have to talk about that one day because I'm very interested in that whole technology and how you can utilize it much more effectively for disasters. But today, you were in Calgary in June of 2019, and I saw you speak, and it was in particular, you were talking about the Waffle House Index, and I loved your speech, and I know that you coined that term in, I think it was 2011. Can you just explain exactly what the Waffle House Index is?
Yeah, it actually goes back to 2004. When the hurricanes were hitting, we went down to Charlotte County where the first Hurricane Charlie hit. And Tallahassee's way up in the north end of the state, and it was better for us to stay down in the area of impact to help manage things. And so obviously you got to eat, you got to sleep. We weren't getting much of that. And so the second day we were there, we were getting up at like 4 o'clock in the morning and trying to find something open. And there was so much power outage stuff, there wasn't anything. So we actually got on the interstate and drove south away from the area. And the first thing we came to was a Waffle House. It was open. And if you've ever seen the iconic pictures, they're pretty much across the South. They're bright yellow signs. They're very lit up. And it's a diner. It's nothing fancy, but they're open. And we go in there and we sit down. And instead of getting the regular menu, they hand us a photocopy of a limited menu. And so this is all we had. Our freezer went out. So we only have the fresh stuff. So if you want anything that's on this menu, you can get it. So we got eggs and bacon and coffee and all the usual breakfast stuff. And so that was like we start our day again. Next morning, there's a Waffle House opened up closer. We didn't have to drive south. It was up where we were staying. So we went into that one, and it was a similar situation. They had just gotten open. They had a photocopy of a menu, and it was only the fresh stuff you could get. And so this kind of progressed on the next day was as things started normalizing, what we kept finding as we were staying about an hour south of where the storm hit just to have a place to stay. As we drove back up, we kept noticing the closer you got to the area of devastation, the first thing that was open was a Waffle House. So that was kind of this interesting thing. But what came up with the Waffle House Index was something we were doing, not about the Waffle House, but in Florida we have our local subdivisions or governments or counties, and we had 67 counties in Florida. When Hurricane Charlie hit, it hit down in southwest Florida, south of Tampa Bay, but cut across to Orlando, did tremendous damage to the Orlando airport, and then went out over Daytona Beach. So we had about 12 counties that had heavy impacts. The problem was they didn't realize how badly hit their neighbors were. And there was a lot of complaints about, hey, we're not getting anything. How come you guys aren't here? Why are you down there? And I said, I don't think people have a graphical representation of devastation. So I said, let's just do something simple. Let's use a traffic light. Red is bad, yellow is and green, you're on your own. And we kind of mapped out the counties. We started out with ideas that if your EOC is operational, fully staffed, going 24 hours, you're red. If it's a partial activation, limited staffing, you're yellow. If your EOC is closed, you're green. Schools, are they closed? You're red. If they're open, but not everything's open, you're not back to normal classes, you're yellow. If you're back to full classes, you're green. And we had done this across a variety of sectors, whether it was power, water, search and rescue. And it quickly gave us the ability on the map to kind of show how that devastation looked as far as response activities. Well, two of the guys that I was working with, Ben Nelson, who's now with the National Weather Service, he's a meteorologist in Jacksonville weather, but at that time was the state meteorologist for the Florida Division of Emergency Management. And Lieutenant Tad Warfel, who was at that point was Major Warfel of the Florida National Guard. They were the two people I was working with. And so they kind of slipped into my slide deck this Waffle House indicator. And the Waffle House indicator was if they were closed, it was red. If it was open with a limited menu, it was yellow. If they had a full menu, they were green. And that's really how this thing got started. But what was interesting was, as much as it was, I think, done more as a humorous thing, it was fairly reflective of the fact that the first thing that would open was a Waffle House. And so Charlie's our first hurricane. Now we get hit by Francis. Then our next big storm is Ivan. And what we had found was if we were going to speed up our response, we couldn't wait for assessments. The traditional emergency management model, locals get hit, they assess, they send their request up to the next level of government. They send people down there to assess it. Yes, it's bad. Okay, now we'll go and send help. We'll go to the next level. And I'm like, guys, we're spending a lot of time assessing, and that's not an outcome. That's process. I said, why don't we just respond like it's bad? Well, then the question was, well, how do you know you've gotten to the hard-hit area? Because when you start going in on hurricanes, they're very large areas, and you'll start picking up damages, tens of miles away from where the heavy devastation is. And so the question was, where do you stop and go to work? And so we said, well, if you get there and the Waffle House is open and it's got a full menu, keep going. It ain't that bad. If you get there and the Waffle House has a limited menu, we probably got a lot of power outages and mass care issues, but probably not in the area where the search and rescue teams need to go to work. If we get to where the Waffle House is closed because of the storm, go to work. You're in the hard-hit area. And it kind of worked out interesting because on the interstate system in the south in Florida, there's almost every exit you get off, there's a Waffle House.
Wow.
So if you're driving out across the interstate heading out towards Pensacola from Tallahassee, where we had all this stuff staged, it was kind of again, as you got out there, it was a fairly good indicator. Fast forward to 2005. We sent a lot of mutual aid folks into Mississippi after Katrina. We sent about 6,000 people. And we had people on the ground the morning after, actually that night when Katrina hit. We were driving in behind the storm. And again, as they were going across on Interstate 10, getting down before they turned down to the coast, as they were coming out of Alabama, there were still Waffle Houses open. But as they got a little bit further, they were closed. And when they went and got down on the coast, they found they almost wanted to come up with a new indicator. I said, no, 3's good. The Waffle Houses were slabs. They were totally swept away in the hurricane.
Wow.
But then several days later, they sent me a picture of a Waffle House slab with a sign in front of it that says, reopening soon. And Waffle House was the first commercial business to reopen in the Gulf Coast of Mississippi. So this indicator actually started looking at, it was kind of interesting. It's like, trying to diagnose a person that has a disease. And you can run all these diagnostics, but sometimes just simple things like taking a pulse will tell you a lot. Well, instead of waiting for full assessments, the Waffle House was telling a lot about a community. Because think about it. Waffle House, they have one standing rule for their store managers, is get open. They're running 24 hours a day, 7-day a week. They don't close. So if they get closed for a disaster, they have one mission, get open. They actually send their corporate officers down from Atlanta to go work the grill, drive supplies in. So they're very focused on getting their stores open. So if they can't get open, that tells you a lot of things are bad. One, the store may be heavily damaged, but two, not having power isn't why they won't get open. If they don't have gas, they can't get open, or if they can't get staff in there. So it tells you, if the Waffle House can't get open, there's a lot of things that are preventing people from getting in, or they're not able to get gas. But if they don't have water, they can open. They'll bring bottled water and hand wipes and put everything on plastic. If they don't have power, they'll bring in generators and get lights up. And as long as they have gas and can get their grills going, they'll start cooking. So if they're red, that's an indicator you got a lot of impacts. If they're yellow, it tells you there's either boil water orders or there are power outages that have knocked out their freezers. And if you think about the community you're serving population-wise, well, if they've got boiled water orders, you probably got a lot of other issues going on. Maybe not as much like search and rescue and the tactical response to the lights and sirens crowd, but you're definitely going to have a lot of mass care issues. But if a Waffle House is green and up and running, that tells you people can get to work, you have power, you have water, and they're able to get supplies in there. And so just looking at them kind of as a quick indicator could tell you a lot about a community, more than just, well, they're open or closed. Because think of all the things it takes for a small little restaurant to get up and open after a disaster. And as we did this Waffle House Index kind of took off and got publicized a lot. But it was something I think as emergency managers we were failing to do. We were so often focused on what government is doing, we forgot to look at what the private sector was doing. And again, as we did this, I ultimately, by the time I got to FEMA, I had an opportunity to meet with the folks from Waffle House, and they were just thrilled about the whole Waffle House Index because they don't advertise. And so they were getting in the Wall Street Journal and all this other stuff about this, but it was this idea that, they were focused on getting open. And I said, why? What is it in your interest? Because it's not cheap. You're not making money those first couple of days. You're spending a lot of money to get them open. Why? And they said, well, it really comes down to our employees, they call them their associates, and their customers. So our folks don't make a lot of money. This is their job. And if they're not working, they're not making money. And we owe it to get them open and put them to work. Second thing is we've got customers that they don't know where else to eat. This is their place for breakfast every morning. It's sort of like a Tim Hortons. If you don't have a Tim Hortons, or some people would go into caffeine withdrawal. And they say, we serve our community. And they said, and I've seen this personally. A lot of the times, if you think about people that are in a disaster area where they've been fire, or they've had windstorms, and everything's disruptive, they're running on adrenaline, they're just trying to cope with everything going on. To go into a restaurant in all this devastation and sit down, and get something to drink and have something to eat and get to decompress. It's almost like you get to step out of that disaster zone. And what's really interesting is you start hearing people telling the stories. And it turns out that storytelling is an important part of their coping with the event and the healing process of being able to talk about what happened to people that are there, not people that are coming in, but the people that are there to go through it. And so Waffle House says, we see this as our job to get open. It is less about our bottom line as much as about our customers and our employees, because we know that if we serve them during that disaster, they're going to come back after the disaster. And so they put a lot of emphasis on it. They have an emergency operations center. They've really stepped up their game because of this Waffle House Index, they told me, and they put a lot of emphasis on that. But it goes to show that what I would call what I found ourselves doing was what I call government-centric problem solving. We always thought government had to be the solution to every problem we ran into. It turned out the faster we can get stores like a Waffle House or a grocery store or a drugstore back open, the less demand it had on the resources we had, so we could focus on the areas that were hardest hit or people that were least likely to be able to take advantage of that. And it started reframing how we talked about the private sector. A lot of times we talked about the private sector, what they could do for us. We can contract with them, they can do stuff. And I'm like, I think we're asking the wrong question. The question we should be asking, what can we do to get you open? Well, can we make sense of curfews? Because, you talk about a lot of retail. They do their logistics at night. But if you're doing curfews at night, you're shutting down stuff. 24-hour operations where and it was really interesting. Waffle Houses almost always universally get a pass against curfews because the people that are working those shifts want to go somewhere to get something to eat. So they say, Waffle House, you're exempt from the curfew. We want you open because that's where we're going to go eat. Yeah. But it was this whole idea like curfews, getting debris off of roads and opening up access to areas so they could get their stores open. providing security in areas, because, again, they're not going to be able to open in areas where it's not safe. But if it's safe, and again, for Waffle House, this really wasn't an issue, because if you ever went to South in Florida during hurricanes, the cars you saw outside of a Waffle House in a disaster response were National Guard Humvees, sheriffs and highway patrol vehicles, lots of police vehicles there, big utility trucks. So they rarely had any problem. But a lot of other places, it goes back to, if it's safe to get open, we can get our people in and we can start retailing. And I think it was a very powerful lesson, but it was also a slow lesson for us to adopt in Florida in 2004. Was getting stores open was probably more important than trying to get supplies into an area. Because if the stores could get open, they had a built-in logistical system. People could get what they really needed, not what we were prepared to hand out. But it also meant we could reshift our focus to the most harder hit communities, particularly those that didn't have those kind of stores. We have a lot of rural areas in Florida. There's no big stores near them. They're having to drive 20, 30, 40 miles to get stuff. And when you have no power, there's no gas, they're not able to get those stores. So if we're able to focus on those rural areas or the areas that aren't served or where people don't have resources to go take care of themselves and free up the rest of the team to do that, that sped up everything. But it meant you had to now look at the team that we would call the emergency management team is not just government and volunteers anymore. It had to incorporate the private sector. And a lot of people do pretty good with the utilities, with the electrical utilities, but I think we still need to do more work to understand that the stuff that is every day out there, like gas stations, drugstores, all the pharmacies, everything like that, that's basically meeting those needs on a day-to-day basis where people can take care of themselves. Getting that open is a key part of getting communities back to where they're stable. But it also does several things. It puts people back to work, and it gets people paying taxes, which is government. As much as everybody hates their taxes, the reality is you need to get your tax base going, sales tax, other things. That's how you pay for these responses.
Yeah. No, and I'm so glad to hear you talk about that private sector piece, because I find that that's the message I keep sending here in Canada when I'm out training. It's if you don't take care of your businesses, they're going to leave. And your recovery is going to be that much harder. So, that's fantastic, advice that you're giving, because I believe that is critical. And the whole thing with the Waffle House, as far as other businesses, so as a business model, the Waffle House, they're trying to be open 365, 24/7. What are some simple things that they do that other businesses could learn from to help them be more prepared?
Well, what they did was they didn't go out and build a huge 3-ring binder of every protocol they got to follow. They got a really small sheet. And what they do is they focus on what are the minimal steps it takes to get open. Yeah. And they come down from corporate prepared to reopen stores that don't have power, don't have water. Essentially, as long as the building is intact and safe, they can get open. Yeah. They got to check on their employees. They'll actually shift employees from non-impacted stores in to help open up. Because a lot of times the people in the area may be dealing with their own problems. They may be evacuated. And they'll actually, again, it's kind of fun when the CEO of the company's down there cooking on a grill. Right. They've got all their steps like, you don't have water, how do you make coffee? Well, they're bringing in cases of bottled water. They actually were doing this during Joplin tornado in Missouri, where I think a lot of this got started again in 2011, thinking this was brand new, but it wasn't brand new. It was just the first time they've ever heard of it. They were actually making coffee by pouring their bottled water into the coffee maker and making coffee, because the entire town was on their boiled water order. A block away was a Starbucks. And again, Joplin was one of these, we'd gone down, it had been a long day. We see the Starbucks, there's cars parked all around it, they'll pull in, let's get a coffee. And we get up to the door and it's closed. And we couldn't figure out why everybody was parked around the Starbucks. Well, it turned out they never turned off their Wi-Fi. So it pointed out that one of the things that I think we underappreciate is how much connectivity helps people start managing their own recovery. So they were closed because they had a boiled water. And 2 doors down, there's a Waffle House, and they're making coffee by pouring water into the coffee maker. So that starts giving you the idea that they take and break down discrete steps of how to operate when they don't have power, they don't have water, or the water's boiled order. They can bring staff in They may have lost power, and so they don't use anything. I mean, they're very safety conscious. They said the last thing we want to do is get anybody sick.
Yeah.
We're already dealing in situations where those are the things you're worried about. So if they don't have potable water, everything goes on plastic. There's no ice. The ice maker's down, so unless they're able to bring in ice, but they can get you hot coffee, they can get you cool drinks because the drinks are in they'll put those in the refrigerator and get the generator going, get them cooled down.
Yeah.
And they'll bring in the extra dumpsters. They'll bring in, if they need to bring in portalettes and hand wash stations. And everything is designed around, as long as the store building is safe, what steps they need to do. And that's why they start out in a condition of yellow with a limited menu, because they can't offer the full menu, but they'll offer the things they know they can store, safely prepare in that environment, and they get open. But they're big. It's kind of this. They just drive this across their organization. It's get open, and they don't have to put in all the caveats about get open safely. Don't do stupid stuff, because people know that's kind of their other part of their culture is food safety, personnel safety, everything. But this idea of get open is, what does it take to get open? And they have this. It's basically just a short sheet of discrete steps you take, and if you can do this, you go to this and open. They'll do stuff like when with the power out, internet out, you can't do a lot of credit card transactions, stuff like that. They'll bring in cash from their corporate headquarters. They go to the bank and they just get cash. And that way they can pay their associates. They'll start operating. And they're even getting to the point now where they're starting to talk about bringing in the satellite so they can get the because they now take debit card, credit cards, just get those back up. But it's just, again, where a lot of other companies like the Starbucks, and it's nothing against Starbucks, it's just, their machines are built in and take direct piping from the system. They don't have an ability to pour water into their espresso machine. Yeah. So it shuts them down. But other companies, is not just Waffle House. Some of the big boxes like Lowe's and Home Depot, we saw Home Depot that got hit in the Joplin tornado, and there were fatalities there, totally leveled their building. Everything was crunched. 2 days later, they had skid loaders. They cleared off their front parking lot, had a big circus tent set up, and were starting to retail supplies so people could start repairing and doing temporary repairs on their homes. And again, their store is on the ground. They're dealing with lost employees. They've lost customers that were killed in that tornado. Yet they were able to get open because, quite honestly, for Joplin, the devastation was so bad that people needed supplies, and they were now having to drive 40, 50 miles away to get stuff. And they didn't reopen with every product they had, but they got the stuff people were going to need. They had the generators, they had the tarps, they had the plywood, they had the construction material, they had the safety equipment, and people could literally go get stuff in their community versus having to leave their community to try to repair their homes.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Well, is there anything else you want to mention before we wrap up? Because I know I have a feeling we could talk for about 2 hours, and maybe we'll talk again. But anything else that maybe you wanted to mention?
Yeah, I think as emergency managers, when we're talking about the private sector, I think we need to start with the first question, which is, what can we do to help you get open? Because for every store we get open, for every business that's back online, FEMA did a lot of work looking at small businesses, and we saw this in Florida. Small businesses have the highest failure rate in disasters. It can go as high as 70% of them don't come back. So I got two things I want emergency managers to think about. One, what can we do to get you open? And the second thought, particularly if you're coming from the outside into a disaster area, hire local and buy local. Put the economy back to work.
That is awesome. That's interesting, because the one we use when we're training is 1 in 4 won't reopen, but you're saying it could be as high as 70%?
Yes, we've seen it. Again, if you think about just normal churn and turnovers and things like restaurants, this just accelerates for a lot of businesses that were right on the edge. Yeah. And we have seen in some of our communities that get as high as 70%. And a lot of it comes back to they have extreme cost in trying to reopen. They may have insured the building, maybe even contents, but they don't have business interruption insurance. And we've seen too often where the tendency is during disasters is you're bringing everything from the outside to the community that's impacted. Well, if there's nothing there, that's great. But if you can get stuff open, then quit feeding. I mean, think about it. We're feeding all our responders, MREs and T-RATs and big kitchens. Like, why don't we go send them to the restaurants and eat local? And put money back in the community, put people back to work. We're shipping computers and copiers and everything else. Yeah, it may not be cheap it may not be the lowest bid to buy it there or lease it there, but you're putting the community back to work. You're getting jobs back. And so I think this is something that's really underappreciated, is the tendency for the responders coming from the outside. So we got to bring everything with us. I'm like, yes, you do. But when you get there and it turns out stuff's open, start buying local. And when you can, hire local and putting that community back to work.
That is awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for taking the time to explain the whole Waffle House Index. I actually used it last week, and I'm going to now have a lot more content to be able to explain to people why something like this is so important and what it means to a community. So thank you for all the work you do. And I will reach out again because I wouldn't mind talking to you about the other work you're doing. But thanks again for taking the time.
My pleasure.